welcome to Leading in the Dark.
Nick, it's great to be here this morning. Thanks for having me.
So, you are the founder of Companion Bakery. That's a well known name in our region. But tell us more. What does Companion do, and how did you get started as the founder?
We've done a lot of things over the years. We are celebrating our 32nd year in business. So I know I don't possibly look that old, but I started the business when I was 24 back in 1993. I graduated from school in the Bay Area, had grown up in a food distribution company. My family had a business called Allen Foods, which was a broadline distributor selling groceries, frozen food, seafood, janitorials into a wide range of food service customers, mainly restaurants, hospitals, country clubs, caterers, that kind of thing. Grew up in that industry. I would have been fourth generation in that business had I gone into it. My dad was third generation, had grown the business pretty substantially. They ended up selling that company in 2002 as part of the roll-up that became US Foods. I'm sure you've seen the US Foods trucks. They bought a handful, a few dozen pretty big regional distributors and rolled that company up in the early 2000s. But had grown up in that business and worked in restaurants when I was in college and after college, and honestly was racing my bike and racing triathlons and looking to do something in the evening so that I could train during the day. Ended up working in Whole Foods Palo Alto in the early 90s after I graduated. I think Whole Foods Palo Alto was store number 5. That's when they were still only opening in college towns across the country. They were in Austin, they were in Durham, North Carolina, they were in Berkeley, they were near Stanford and Palo Alto, and just fell in love with baking. I think those of us that have gone into the industry, either a couple of days in, you run screaming because it's hot and the hours suck and it's hard, or you just fall in love with it. And there was something about taking flour, water, and salt and turning it into something for me that I found to be really magical. And so couple that with my broadline distribution and food experience from my family, ended up moving back to St. Louis at the time of the flood. I don't know if you were around in 93, but the water started in Kansas City and it was wet all the way to St. Louis. And I'm like, what am I doing? But I had ordered an oven from France. It took about 6 months to get here, moved back to St. Louis, just rented about 1,000 square feet from my family in an old warehouse that they owned in South St. Louis off Gustine Avenue, and started baking bread and knew how to make 6 things really after working in a couple of places, and really built the business based on my grandfather's advice, which was shut up and listen to your customers and they'll tell you how to grow your business, and took those 6 things. And really at the time, I think my advice to myself was I got to find 2 great customers to help me tell the story of what I want to do. And for those that have grown up or knew St. Louis at the time, that was Bill Cardwell and that was Vince Bomarito. Bill Cardwell had had a couple of restaurants at the time, but Cardwell's and then eventually Cardwell's at the Plaza in Frontenac Plaza. Every chef that was anybody with new modern American cooking had cycled through his kitchen. So I knew that if I could build the credibility with a relationship with Bill, I could grow from that. And then Mr. Bomarito had Tony's restaurant, which was St. Louis's only 5-diamond, 4-star, 5-diamond for decades and decades, was really the epitome of dining, especially fine dining in St. Louis. Unfortunately, they just closed that restaurant a couple of years ago, but for many years, especially when I opened, they were really it. And so I knew if I could figure out how to get them to purchase my products or even take my products, whether I had to purchase them or not, I could start to tell that story. And knock on wood, based on some relationships and just based on and relentlessness of going into them, they both started buying bread for the table and just kept listening to them telling that story. Bill then needed a bun for lunch, and it grew into a relationship with the Ritz-Carlton and Clayton, and then they needed dinner rolls and pastries. And so we grew the business over time listening to our customers. And that same kind of thing happened in the I guess about 2012. We were approached by a grocery store chain out of Colorado that had opened a store in Columbia, Missouri. They needed product. They called and said, hey, we need bread tomorrow. Can you help us out? We've been buying from a frozen distributor and they couldn't get it to us. And again, in listening to customers and saying yes first and figuring out later if that was a good way to grow, we started delivering daily to Columbia. That grew into a relationship and producing frozen product for them across the country. And then we have slowly, really since 2012, transitioned the business from a fresh business to a frozen business. ended up moving, building a new factory in 2015, really took the opportunity during the pandemic to convert fully. So now today, Companion is a frozen bread manufacturer, shipping par-baked bread, custom products, specialty buns and sandwich breads and rolls to over 1,000 customers across the country. And that's what we're growing now. I still do a lot of business locally in St. Louis through grocery and food service, but also a lot of business outside of St. Louis. And our primary objective is to help our customers tell their story. And so it's really a lot of custom manufacturing, some private label stuff, and really working with some great customers that we've built great relationships with. Pretty long-winded answer, Nick, so you're sorry about that.
No, I have a lot of questions just because I'm not familiar at all with your industry. But at the beginning, when you were describing producing the product specifically for a couple restaurants, was one, was that the vision to have those types of customers as opposed to consumer or I guess direct to consumer? But then also, is that the common way that the industry works, that restaurants outsource their bread or pastries with a partner like you as opposed to doing it in-house?
I'll answer the first question first. I think the food service side of the business, so anywhere in which somebody's using the product as a menu item on the table in a bread basket, that is certainly a faster and easier way to grow the business than trying to build a brand at retail. Because building a brand at retail it's expensive. It's advertising, it's coupons, it's a full breadth of products to develop a line. It's hard to go into a grocery store with one SKU or one product. You have to have a line of products. I think we always thought we would eventually get to grocery, where we certainly grocery represents about 50% of our business now. And I think that was probably in the back of my head somewhere as a naive 24-year-old. I thought we would get there eventually, but really we just really didn't go into the grocery business out of the gate because it wasn't the easiest way to do it. It wasn't the fastest way to get our product to the market. And then to answer your second question, yeah, most folks do no different than most folks aren't growing their own vegetables. They're outsourcing. There is a whole community of micro vendors, both in St. Louis and obviously across the country, that are producing those specialty items for folks. So if you think about, we're baking breads for them and potentially pastries. There are specialty farmers growing beautiful organic or intentionally grown and curated specialty produce. There's microbreweries brewing beer. There's micro roasters roasting coffee for those folks. And the really strong restaurateurs, some of them will try to do it themselves if they can, or if they have a particular item that's important to them and they want to make it, and that's terrific. But most folks they really recognize that the accumulation of all of those things and telling their story through all of those different products is the best way for them to operate a restaurant. And so most folks are outsourcing at least baking. It takes a lot of space, it takes a lot of time, it's done at a different time of day that they don't necessarily want to be managing. So I would say most folks are certainly outsourcing that.
I want to also touch on the family business part because that's just intensely fascinating to me because I come from a little bit of a family business background as well. Having a third generation family business is an amazing accomplishment. You were there poised as the fourth, and as you described, there was a decision to sell the business. Was that a significant emotional event for you? Maybe you thought you were going to take it over, but then it went a different path.
I think it was probably a more significant emotional event for my father and my grandfather than it was for me. I just didn't have a passion for the distribution business. You know, they went to work with a tie every day. It wasn't the way in which I wanted to go to work. I really fell in love with making something. And I think once I started doing that, it was really important to me to be able to continue to do that. And in full disclosure, my grandfather loaned me the $86,000 to buy the oven, and he couldn't have been more supportive of what I was doing. And I think when he did that, and certainly there was no pressure, there was no guilt, you know, this was the direction that I wanted to go, and they wanted to support it. And it was very much a peripheral business. They were my dad said something many years later. He said, "Look, I'm so much more proud of you having built this business and created something from nothing than I ever would have been if I would have said, 'Boy, my son's one hell of a sales manager,' or 'He's doing a great job buying for our company.'" It would have I think it was an opportunity. They were so entrepreneurial, especially with the generations. It would have been less entrepreneurial in the fourth generation than it certainly was for them. And that unique challenge was just something that was driving me, and that was certainly their fault or because of them, I think in all the positive ways to say that. So they were incredibly supportive of of the opportunity. And I think it was the right time for them. They had just turned 100. I think they were 101 years old when they sold their business. And really, the world was changing and the consolidation in the industry was changing. And so I think for many reasons, it was the right decision. And it was interesting, though. I certainly grew up always believing until the day I walked into Whole Foods and started baking bread that I would go back to work for the family business. And that wasn't out of obligation. That was just, I guess, what I thought it was going to be. And when it wasn't, it was okay. And they were incredibly supportive.
How fortunate for you to have that support. A lot of second and third generation family business folks that I know have a very different story. The older generations are perhaps a little bit harder on them than the story that you described for yourself.
Yeah, and I think that's true. And I grew up, I worked in customer service. I ran hotshot deliveries in the van. I cleaned the freezer. I cleaned trucks. I did everything there. My grandfather believed that it's all work and it all has to be done. And certainly his family was going to have to start at the absolute bottom and do everything in there. So I had certainly done the work and put the time in to garner the respect of folks in the organization. And many of them still work for US Foods now, and I still have a great relationship with those folks. And they talk about that a lot, that there were certainly no favors given to the family. And so I was poised, if you want to use that word, to be able to do it. I certainly had built the foundation. And when this opportunity presented itself, and look, I was 24 years old. There was a really good chance that the bakery could have lasted a couple of years and I could have gone back to work for the family business. There was certainly no part of me at 24 that thought I would be sitting here with you 32 years later having a conversation about the origin story. I don't think I could look more than 6 months down the line, certainly, and didn't really understand whether the industry would get there or where any of this stuff would go.
So, what was that sales pitch to your grandfather that convinced him to loan you the money to get started? Did you just see some passion that was just not going to go away?
I guess so. I certainly had stayed in California for a few years and continued to bake and brought in product and wrote a business plan up. I had gone to work for a small grocery store chain while I was also baking. There was a store called the Oakville Grocery Company, which has since been bought by a company called Dean and DeLuca, which is a specialty grocery store. But at the time, Oakville had 3 stores and they were getting ready to expand into 10 stores throughout the Bay Area. And they hired me. I knew I was swimming actually with the president of the company, training in the pool with him. And he just said, look, I'd like you to do a research project. I know you're baking. I know you know something about the industry. How about we build a business plan for what it would take for us to build a bakery to service these 10 stores? It was a specialty wine, cheese sandwich shop, really, what the Oakville Grocery Company was. Very small stores, 2 to 4,000 square feet. So these weren't big grocery stores. And so we spent about 8 months or 12 or 8 or 10 months building this business plan. What would the equipment need to be? What would the product mix need to be? How would we do it? And in the end, unfortunately, with the way the Bay Area is geographically, one bakery just never could have supported stores from Santa Cruz down south all the way up to Napa Valley and over to Walnut Creek. There wasn't enough hours in the day for one store to bake and do that kind of distribution. It just, the traffic was too bad. It just didn't make sense. And there were already great bakers on a wholesale level that could service those stores in a way that really didn't make a lot of sense to try to compete with some great bakeries that were already in operation. And so they said, hey, thanks. We really appreciate the work that you put in. It's a great business plan, but it just doesn't make sense for us. And so they just said, why don't you go do it? Why don't you go home and do it? And so I basically had the plan. I knew what the equipment list needed to be. I knew what the initial product mix could be. I had a sense of what the formulas were going to be, what the price points needed to be. St. Louis, like it has always been, was 7 or 9 years behind either coast. And so what was happening in the Bay Area at that time wasn't really yet to happen in St. Louis. But Bread Company had done a lot. So the St. Louis Bread Company at the time was just figuring out that they were going to grow this behemoth of a retail operation. They were actually selling wholesale breads into grocery stores and to some restaurants at the time in the early 90s. They were just backing out of that business. And so there was a little bit of a vacuum formed that I was able to step into and service some small specialty grocery stores and then some restaurants with fresh product. And they had certainly started to show people that grocery store bread wasn't the only bread that was out there, that a specialty bakery, that there was a market and a viability for that kind of product. And so the timing just ended up being really perfect for that opportunity. And we snuck in, and I don't think we realized it at the time, but that void really was a great opportunity for us.
And so, was Bread Company really the only competition to speak of? at that time?
There's a couple of big Italian bakeries that are still big commercial Italian bakeries that are still around in St. Louis that are still somewhat competition for us. They were there then. There were a couple of small little specialty shops, but I think one, my persistence and relentlessness was hard to compete with on the specialty side, and two, my family's knowledge of the distribution piece that because the hardest part for most bakers, still for us today, is not from the mixer to the oven, it's from the oven to the customer. And so the logistics of getting that product produced, packaged correctly, delivered on time in the right form, where the customer wants it, when they want it, and how they want it is still the most challenging part for wholesale bakers. Most of us go into the business because we love baking. We don't love the distribution side or the logistics side. But I was pretty good at that. And I had a family that I could lean to on how to do that, how to pick and pack, how to set up routes, how to get into that distribution side. And now today into the distribution channel with distributors and redistributors and all of the other aspect. And so that additional knowledge coupled with our ability to make a pretty good product and our ability to sell it really that was our competitive advantage. Really, it continues to be to this day.
Going back to perhaps some of the early years, what was really the turning point from when you were serving a handful of really well-known local restaurants to becoming something much bigger?
There were probably a handful of those moments. I think one of the biggest moments was in 90 the end of 95 when Bob Deerberg approached us about going into all their stores. And so I think we tripled our business overnight in terms of the number of pounds of bread we were producing when we went from essentially a handful of grocery stores into servicing the whole Deerberg's chain. They continue to be one of our best customers. We've continued to make more and more different things for them, some things under their label now and some things under ours. But at the time, that was a big moment, that was that moment where we put the brand forward as before when it was just, wholesale into food service. It really wasn't our brand. It was our product, but not our brand. And so the Deerberg's move did that a little bit. And then I think the second biggest turning point probably would have been that moment in 2012 when the specialty grocery store approached us about taking the product frozen across the country. That forced us to build a new factory, that forced us to really think about what the opportunities could be long term in terms of the direction of the business. And, so I think those were the two biggest turning points in the business as it related to the big leapfrog kind of steps.
In the Deerbergs example, talking about tripling the size of the business almost overnight, it's possible to grow yourself right out of business.
Sure.
So how did you practically manage that kind of instantaneous growth?
I just doubled down. We bought another couple of ovens, hired a few more people. Candidly, it's ridiculous to think about it, but I was working, I think for the first 3 years of the business, I worked 18 to 20 hours a day, 6 days a week. I went to work. My kids laugh. I went to work at 9 p.m. and got home at 5 p.m. every day for about 3 years. And so, look, you can get a lot done then. You can manage a fair number of people when you never go home. I wouldn't recommend it. It certainly, but sometimes that's what you have to do to make these things work. And so there was never a moment in time where I didn't think I could produce. I've never turned an order down in the history of the bakery. And we've certainly taken some orders that have really punched us in the gut in terms of speed and volume, but it's just not in my nature to say no to something that I think we can do. And we've built an organization of people who have that same kind of mentality. Now we figure out later how to do it more efficiently and how to do it better and how to grow into that. But sometimes the opportunities don't always come knocking, right, Nick? You can't turn too many things down.
Well, can you dig into that a little bit more about how you build an organization that's willing to take on those challenges? Because for folks in our role, we're going to be exactly like you described. We're all in, we'll do anything it takes, any hours of the day. That's just the nature of being the business owner. That type of rapid growth can cause a lot of stress in your team. So, can you share more about how you led your teams through that to be able to adapt?
I think probably primarily or first and foremost, I think it's a willingness for yourself to roll up your sleeves and get in and make sure that you're a part of that, getting your ass kicked, but it's going to be painful for the organization in the short term. And so as long as you're willing to participate in that, that goes a long way, obviously leading by example. Two, I think you have to build the credibility over time that when these opportunities present themselves, okay, maybe we're going to have to do something by hand. Maybe we're going to have to do something without automation for a period of time to get this going. But the organization and the people within it know that as soon as we figure out what investment we can make, we're going to make that investment. So we try to make the pain as short term as we can. So we honestly had an opportunity just this winter in February to produce a ridiculous number of sheets of gooey butter cake, as an example. I don't know, we make 1,000 sheets of gooey butter cake a year or something, and we had an order for almost 40,000 sheets of gooey butter cake in 6 weeks. And so it was a lot of handwork to start, and then while we're doing that, we're finding the equipment. We got a rush of equipment in, so a couple weeks into it, we got half the things. We got something done that allowed us to automate part of the filling, and then we got something done to automate the crust, and then by the end of it, what was a 10-person process has now become a 3-person process at a much more gentler pace. And now, as we continue to grow and do that moving forward, it isn't going to kill us forever. And I think if I didn't have the credibility to and the folks to realize that I would go out there and find ways to make it more efficient and make it better and make it not kill us, that they'd be much more reluctant to jump in at the beginning, if that makes any sense. So I think you have to build the credibility in the organization that the goal is not to kill the organization for a buck, but sometimes you got to kill yourself for a few weeks, maybe a month, while you figure out how to make it a little bit more efficient. And so I think that's been the biggest opportunity or the biggest way in which I can get folks to rally around those opportunities.
The other big transition you mentioned was going from fresh to frozen. So again, forgive my ignorance about the industry, but at least to me, it's not immediately obvious that bread is a frozen product at scale. Can you educate me more on that? And
Any perishable item that you're going to try to ship across the country, obviously some of it can be under refrigeration, but freezing really is a pretty magical thing. It does really stop the degradation or the staling process. And so with bread, a lot of product now is frozen, and then that product can go into the store or to the restaurant in a frozen state, and then as they pull it out, slack it out, they can use it as they need it, and they have essentially a fresh product. Bread comes out of the freezer the same way that it goes in. So we produce a product, comes out of the oven, it cools to ambient temperature, and then we put it into a blast freezer. So in an ideal world, our product is frozen 2 hours after it comes out of the oven, incredibly fresh. It gets frozen, and then it goes into that suspended animation, if you want to call it that. And then when it comes out the other end for the restaurateur, for the grocery store or whatever, they can refresh it in the oven, and then they really do have a really terrific fresh product. And so the industry has changed a lot, not in the technology, because the freezing has always existed, but in the acceptance of that technology. And so restaurateurs that used to only want to buy fresh now realize that a frozen product gives them more versatility, make sure they don't run out, allows them to have extra product if they need it without being concerned about that product going to waste or staling, and just gives them a lot more flexibility and nimbleness to take things, whether it's a grocery store to always have their shelves full or a restaurateur to make sure that he never runs out of anything. And so that transition, just if we wanted to grow the business outside of St. Louis, the way you do it with bread, if you don't want to do some ridiculously extended shelf life product like a Wonder Bread, then you have to do it with freezing. So if we're using no preservatives, if we're using a clean label product in order to get that shelf life, if we're shipping bread to Phoenix, Arizona or to Dallas, Texas, that product needs to be frozen. And so freezing it is what allows us to do that.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense as you describe it. And you just comment on clean label products. I wanted to ask the question, what are some of the trends you're seeing these days in your industry and the products that you make?
Certainly, sustainability is a big one, and sustainability can be described in any number. It's not really just organic anymore. Sustainability could be supporting regenerative agriculture. So we work with ADM, the largest miller in the world, but they have a regenerative agriculture program that we participate in, and so they're doing a lot of things to help the farmer protect the soil, whether that's cover crops, whether that's no-till, whatever the different mechanisms that they can do. And so that sustainability has value. So from whom we buy our ingredients, how those ingredients are processed or not processed is a big piece of the trend that we're seeing. We're also clean label, like I said, no preservatives, no extended shelf life, to the best of our ability. We'll use a little bit of vinegar in product to inhibit mold growth, but we're not using mold inhibitors that are artificial or extending shelf life out that far. That's an important component. And then really I think it's just specialty bread is having a moment. I think there is definitely a reduction in carbohydrate intake for people. So people are more, I'm going to use the air quotes, carb aware than they used to be. The best example I can give you, when I think I mentioned that we made dinner rolls for the Ritz-Carlton when we first opened, and the formula that the Ritz used in the mid 90s was if they had a banquet for 100 people, they ordered 250 dinner rolls. Everybody ate 2.5 dinner rolls per person. That number now is zero point 0.5. And most of even the zero point 0.5 aren't even being eaten. So, people are choosing their carbs more deliberately. And so if I'm going to eat a sandwich, I want it to be on something special or something unique. If I'm going to have bread served at the table, I want it to be something special. Restaurateurs are charging for the bread basket now because one, they want to make sure there's no waste, but two, they're going to put an extra energy, extra effort into that. Maybe there's some spreads or specialty butters served alongside that bread, but they're going to make it an appetizer item as opposed to just a giveaway. And where bread's having a moment from a specialty perspective, though the volumes per person are down a little bit, I think. But the other thing that we're also seeing is portability. I saw a stat yesterday that I don't know that I believe it. It said something like 75% of all restaurant food is now to go. I know the number is really high. I can't believe it's 75%, but if it is, that is a complete 180 from where that number was pre-COVID. And so the fact that so many folks are dining out or dining away from the restaurants means that the portability of that food needs to be important. And so sandwiches become a big piece of that. You see a lot of the concepts that are driving a lot of that growth are sandwich concepts. A lot of our business is coming from specialty hamburger chains, coming from specialty delis, multi-unit operators that have a unique and special product or presentation that they're making in that. And that product needs to be good. Crust needs to maintain itself through travel. An example is we work with a burger concept here in St. Louis that over the pandemic found that the average time that it took from the flat top to the consumer eating their product was almost up to 45 minutes or an hour since the pandemic. Now they make the burger, they have to put it in a box, they wait for the DoorDash guy to show up. He's usually 15 minutes late, then it's 20 minutes to make the delivery. So now all of a sudden, that product is 45 minutes or an hour old. And so the same hamburger bun that's great fresh in the restaurant is not the same bun that can sit with grease on it for 45 to 60 minutes and not disintegrate when the customer opens that product at home. And so we've done a lot of work with customers taking fat out of buns, making things like leaner because all of the grease then is absorbed and that bun still has integrity on the other end. Where a lot of times, as people were figuring this out, you'd buy a hamburger, get it delivered to your house, and the bottom bun especially, would almost have disintegrated. And so it's been really interesting to listen. And again, because we listen and talk to our customers about stuff like that, it's been really interesting to hear the changes that they need as the delivery of food mechanism has changed so dramatically.
As you mentioned sustainability, I had actually written that down before this conversation happened because I noticed that on your social media, you comment a lot about sustainability. So I suspect it's more than you just responding to a trend. It seems a very important thing to you personally.
Yes. I'll say this. I'll say that sustainability saved our business. When we moved into the new factory, we really lost our way. So we went from 15,000 square feet to 45,000 square feet. We were doubling our business and we were starting to generate a tremendous amount of waste. And you mentioned you can grow yourself right out of business. We were on the verge of that in 2016, 2017, 2018. We were running out of cash. Even though the business was growing, we just couldn't get our arms around it. And we started to realize that the volume of waste that we were generating was really significant. And so as an organization, we sat down and we said, look, let's just figure out how to produce less trash. And we went on this trash initiative over the last 7 or 8 years that has fundamentally changed the organization. And we started to realize that being sustainable, producing less waste, doing all of these things, recycling more, it all had incredibly positive effects on the bottom line. So we've reduced our landfill contribution since 2017 by 93%. We went from 1.6 million pounds of trash down to about 113,000 pounds of trash on an annual basis that's going to landfill. Now we're composting, we're recycling, we're donating, we're working with local gardeners, sending our buckets out, things like that. Everything used to just go to landfill, but it's less expensive to do that. It's changed the way that we produce product, the way we think about production, the way we think about scheduling, how we can rework doughs that can go back into the same dough later. So we schedule things in a different way. And it fundamentally changed our business for an incredibly positive way. Actually did a TED Talk in 2021 about that, and it was very well received. And it's just continued to be something that's super important to me because I realized that we just weren't, by not paying attention to it, we were really getting ourselves in trouble. And it's grown into, we finally have turned the corner. It takes a few years in a new building to get to the point where you're making any money, but we finally have turned that corner. And this year we've become a 1% for the planet company. So 1% of our top line revenues being donated to environmental causes, mainly in St. Louis, working with the St. Louis Food Bank and some other folks, but we're putting our money where our mouth is. And we have found that to be very positive from our customers' perspective and really from our bakers' perspective. It's helped with retention. It's helped with people feel good about a greater purpose with what we're doing on a daily basis. And so sustainability has become a big piece of who we are and what we are. And I believe strongly that it's not mutually exclusive to profitability. It's not, you don't do it and then you also figure out how to be operationally efficient. You can do it within the realm of being operationally efficient and it pays big dividends. And a lot of it, some of them are tangible, quantifiable dividends, and some of them are intangible as it relates to some of those other metrics, but all equally as important.
You're again describing a period of potentially radical change in the way the business is operating through all these initiatives. We know that change is very hard for folks. How did you lead your team again through such massive change?
Change is easier when the bank is breathing down your neck. We had the talk, right? I always had one banker who would come see me, who the whole project, this whole SBA loan for the new factory and everything, it was one bank. Couldn't have been any easier, right? And then all of a sudden you start running out of cash, and then all of a sudden 8 bankers come in and they all got suits on and they're pulling out numbers on you that you don't even know what they mean, ratios of things that they're paying attention to. And that fundamentally altered how we had to do things. We were given a very short leash. We were given a leash, knock on wood, because we were still 20 plus years old and they still respected our ability to figure it out, but the leash got pretty short and pretty tight. And so that made a big difference. And again, it was jumping in and doing it. I was right here with folks. We were doing brainstorming sessions with different aspects of the organization. We really invited everybody in. I think a great example, we sat down with our customer service team and we said, look, what can we do to reduce waste? And they said, at the time, we were making 150 or 180 daily deliveries in St. Louis. And they're like, we print 2 copies of every invoice every day. And a lot of them come back. And we said, why is that? They said, only 5 customers. In the bakery business, you drop off a lot of bread before people even show up. And so there's only 5 of 180 customers that had a signature required, where we had to necessarily be able to prove that we had made a delivery. And we said, what if we just stop printing 2 copies and the driver will take a picture of the 5 invoices that they signed, so we'll have a record of it, and we're going to save 180 sheets of paper a day. You pick up a ream of paper, you're saving a ream of paper every 2 days, and you're delivering 360 days a year. It's a lot. That's a lot of weight, right? It's a lot of pounds. And so we took that kind of mentality across the whole organization. Everybody from maintenance, the folks in sanitation, getting rid of paper in the break room and going to melamine plates that we could wash, or giving everybody a water bottle and getting rid of paper cups. And all of these little things started adding up and making a huge difference. And there were a couple of big ones. There was a couple of pieces of equipment that we bought that reduced trim on the dough strip, that made less waste and things like that. But it was really this micro incremental changes that we made that yielded a landfill savings of what now is almost 1.5 million pounds a year. It's really incredible what the organization did. And it was really inspiring. We sat down every month and We created a number here that we call our trash efficiency number, which is our sales divided by pounds of trash. Because one, I hate charts that go down, even if they're supposed to go down. It doesn't feel the right thing. So and we knew that if we were growing the business, there could be a sense that maybe you should generate more trash if your business continues to grow just by happenstance. And so, what if we tried to look at the ratio of every pound of every dollar in sales, how much trash were we generating? And so, we were watching that trash efficiency number. That number has now gone from $5.50 in sales for every pound of trash to a little over $30 in sales for every pound of trash. And that's just been, and there's no more fun than standing in front of the group every month and reporting on what that number is. And it was energizing. And we formed a Waste Watchers committee that started coming up with their own ideas and their own initiatives. And we give awards out on it. So it really took on a life of its own. And that's what you've got to figure out how to do. But that wasn't just me. That was everybody stepping up and saying, okay, what are the little things we can do? How do we continue to drive this change? Because it gets harder and harder every year to keep doing it as we've made all of these micro changes. Now we got to keep trying to find more. And it's a real challenge, but folks are still energized to this day about it.
Josh, these are some really incredible stories that involve lots of layers of leadership. Where did you pick all this up from? Are you just a natural leader, or where are you getting your inspiration to do such amazing things?
I listen to a lot of podcasts. I host my own actually, and I love talking to folks just like you enjoy talking to folks and picking up those individual things. I tour a lot of bakeries. I go out and see what other people are doing, take as many ideas as I can from those opportunities, little things that are changing. I think it goes back to me. My grandfather, I think when my grandfather said, shut up and listen to your customer and they'll help you grow your business, it applies to shut up and listen to your employee, shut up and listen to your banker, shut up and listen to your vendors. All of those things make sense. Continuing to ask questions and looking for ways and taking a super humble approach to how we go after things. And I know the servant leadership thing is cliche, but I believe in that strongly. Like I'm just here to get shit out of people's way so they can do their job really well. I'm certainly not the one doing the majority of the work. And it's really energizing for me every time we can make those improvements and we can celebrate a win as an organization. And it's been my grandfather, my dad, and then really all of our stakeholders play a role in that.
So you mentioned your podcast. Tell me about that.
I think in some ways that we were talking offline before we started in your interest in it. If I strongly believe that my job is to help our customers tell their story, mainly we do that on the plate, right? We make them a bun because that fits the image of the particular dish that they're trying to do, or a piece of bread, or something for the basket because they have a way in which they want the customer to feel welcome into their thing. That still continues to be, we're really not focused on building our brand. We're focused on building partnerships with other brands to help them grow. And the podcast grew out of that. If I want people to tell their story, what's better way to do it than put them behind a microphone? And it's an incredibly selfish endeavor, I think. About half of the guests that I have on the show are customers, potential stakeholders in my business. So some of it is just helping promote what they're doing. Some of it are folks that I want to do business with that I might not, and it may not lead to that, but I'm still interested in what they're doing. And then the other half are just really interesting leaders and entrepreneurs and founders that have been introduced to me, or that I've, knock on wood, in 32 years have had a chance to come across. But still those conversations, really for me, it's how are you leading? What culture are you building? What are the values? How do you live by those values every day when shit's going bad, when things are going well? How do you take core values off the wall and put them into daily practice? And those things are hard, right? And those things that's what you're asking me about. Like, how do you make that happen? And so for me, it's incredibly neat to be able to sit down with somebody over a cup of coffee and have that conversation. And we're all too busy now. Look, as much as I'd like to say that you and I would have met for coffee, I don't know if we really would have figured out how to make that happen, right? But you've got a podcast. I'd love to support you. And there's some value to me to giving my story on your show. And I'm also going to learn something from just in the way you ask questions and present it. So I think it's really interesting, and it's been really fun to do that. And I've learned a lot. Again, we talked again, the metrics are hard. It's hard to know what the return is on a podcast. There's certainly no monetization, at least that I can imagine happening with it. but it's just been a really interesting and really fun thing to do. And I try to do one conversation a week, or if I can get ahead of the game, you get a couple and not feel under pressure. But I've really enjoyed it. It's been a really, it's a great medium. And I do learn a lot from it. I listen to a number of podcasts and I learn an awful lot from those as well. And it's just such a different way than reading because of the conversational nature of it. And I think people tend to be more candid. It's a little less scripted than certainly reading a book is.
And what's the name of the show? It's a good show. I listen to it.
It's called the Baked In Podcast.
There you go. That's a good name. So what's the future hold for Companion?
We're just continuing to try to find multi-unit operators across the country that want to tell a story. So for us, our sweet spot is customers that have between 5 and 150 units. So, a deli chain with 50 units, a grocery store chain with 75. So those are folks that generally are too small for a lot of the big players to really be able to focus energy and do something custom or curated for. And so they're in that middle ground of they're big enough to want and probably deserve something special, but they're too small to get it. And so we're just trying to connect with as many of those folks as we can to allow them to tell their story, to grow their business. And in some instances, they're being hindered by their ability to find exactly what they're looking for. And we love developing those products. And so our tenure, we've got, I think, 35 or 36 brand partners. That's how we look at one of these multi-unit operators. And we're trying to grow that number to 100 in the next 10 years. So if you know anybody with 5 to 150 units who wants something special, then that's what we're doing.
Josh, thanks for sharing these stories, and congratulations on 3 decades plus of business. That's amazing. And thank you for taking the time to talk to me. Again, Companion is a very well-known brand and company, certainly in our region. You're a very well-known and respected individual in our community, and we just happened to meet at an event, and now you've spent close to an hour telling me some of your stories. So I really appreciate that.
Well, Nick, I appreciate you giving me an avenue to do that. And continued good luck with the show and with your new business and everything that you're doing.
Great. Thanks so much, Josh.
Thank you.